Okay, I think this will be the last of these unless there's a strong sentiment. I can maybe produce one for the colonial and revolutionary period or even the early 20th century if people want it. Obviously, I'd like to do that sooner rather than later so everyone can use it. Just let me know via email if these are helpful for you. So the Gilded Age can be a difficult time to get a handle on because kind of like that period from say 1800 to 1848, there's not an organizing event that's coming that's going to change everything. There's a lot of important thematic stuff, but not a lot of sort of tentpole events to focus on, that concrete stuff. The broad theme of the Gilded Age, I would say, is expansion. Geographically, demographically, economically, governmentally, and in terms of racism and white supremacy, they all kind of explode in this time period. I think class warfare you can throw in there as well. So the geographic expansion happens after the Civil War. The Civil War had to assert, or the sectional conflict leading up to the Civil War had put the brakes on expansion because, as you saw with Kansas, deciding whether or not a state would be free or slave meant that it was a huge big deal. And so there was sort of, as I say, putting the brakes on this. As soon as the South seceded, you got a Transcontinental Railroad Act, a Homestead Act, and a Land Grant Act, and some other things that allowed for, once the Civil War was over, a push into the West. Gold rushes also happened. Certainly the one in South Dakota was important. That led to the Lakota War that led to Little Bighorn. A lot of people wanted to, veterans and others, particularly from the South, wanted to escape the ravages of the Civil War. There was a large group of African-American migrants called the Exodusters who went west. And then you have this immigration wave from Europe that we'll talk about that pushed people west as well. Both some immigrant groups, but often other groups that wanted to move out of the sort of pestilential large cities. The West is often now understood as a unique geographic and cultural area that's a competition between these three cultures: Anglo or sort of Anglo-American culture, Hispanic culture, and Native culture. At this time period, Hispanic culture had already been impacted in Texas and to a certain degree California. In the Southwest, in places like Santa Fe, there wasn't a lot because there wasn't a lot of migrations into those areas because there wasn't a lot of water to support that. The main resistance in this part and the main competition came from Native cultures. You want to have an idea of the issues surrounding the Sioux War, the Nez Perce. You probably want to know the Ghost Dance and Wounded Knee. The demographic expansion, the population explodes all over the world. After the Civil War, there's a long period of peace in both North America and Europe. And peace means people don't die and don't starve. Agriculture is beginning to improve. So you have a huge population explosion. People just begin to move. Some of those people moving around Europe slosh out of Europe and into the United States. There's just people all over the place, and some of them wind up on boats. These new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, they were not Protestant. They tended to be Catholic, Jewish, Eastern Orthodox. And American Protestants, I think we've already seen, tremendously anti-Catholic. Now there's even more groups that they can not like. You begin to see race types extended to the different races of the Italians or the Irish or the Russians or Slavs or Poles. And race testing. Ellis Island is created to keep undesirable races out of the United States. Most of the new immigrants who came were not terribly wealthy, and so they tended to settle in these urban areas on the East Coast, and they just explode in population. And for the first time, we begin to see real urban poverty, not just when there's a depression or a panic, but a consistent, pervasive poverty. The progressive movement, when it comes along after this time period, will become focused a great deal on solving the problem of the cities. The economic expansion is probably the most important part in some ways. There was so much money spent on the war, it created this new class of millionaires. And then after the war, you have the technological expansion of railroad, cheap steel, all sorts of industrial processes like mechanized looms, meat packing, the cigarette is invented. And all of these, this industrialization tends to follow this boom-bust cycle. So you have a depression every decade. Some of this is a monetary policy thing. The nation is on the gold standard. And so the economy expands, and then the gold standard acts like a choke collar, and the bubble bursts. That's fairly typical in a gold rush or a gold standard society. If you want to compare this to the New Deal, when we go off the gold standard, we begin to get away from some of this boom-bust cycle. The cheap labor brought by these new immigrants is another thing that helps industrialization explode in the country. The United States also is a very large country with a lot of natural resources that are in some ways uniquely accessible. Russia has a lot of natural resources, but Siberia is Siberia. Whereas, for instance, the iron ore in Minnesota was right near the lakes where you could take it to Pittsburgh where the coal was and make steel. With this economic expansion, you begin to have a couple of important dynamics. One is America becomes a much wealthier country, but it also becomes a much more unequal country. Really, for the first time, you have concentration of poverty and sort of low economic status working class groups, and the rise of labor movements begin to occur. They're never that strong, except maybe for a 30-year period from like the 1930s to the 1960s. They're seen as sort of un-American and radical and foreign. Things like Haymarket Square, you should and the Homestead Strike, you should probably be familiar with those. Again, if you get an essay question on this time period, being able to specifically say the Homestead Strike as opposed to there were strikes will be helpful. Governmental expansion is kind of weird, contradictory. The Civil War creates a huge explosion in the size of the government. Wars do that. Government programs become important for opening the West. Government programs, therefore, are important in creating some of these millionaire classes. And all this new wealth that's being created in the industrial process, and the fact that the government is now actively doing things like subsidizing railroads or so forth, means there's a lot of corruption. The Gilded Age is known for its corruption in government. Some of this is an outgrowth of the spoils system under Jackson. The assassination of Garfield leading to the Pendleton Act was a reaction to some of this, just rank criminality. As these problems grow, the problems of the city, the problems of corruption, you have these increasing calls for reform. The populists are an interesting group. They want a government that helps the common person. They perceive that the government is in the hand of wealthy bankers and industrialists. Populists hated the bankers because their farms were heavily mortgaged. Labor unions were upset with industrialists. They never do create a sort of farm labor power base to challenge the two parties. But the issues they introduce are often picked up by the progressives. The progressive era begins in this time period, but we usually think of it as the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The progressives are a lot of different things. One thing they want is rational government, uncorrupted government, government that sort of reflected middle-class American values, that isn't bought and sold. So the populists, in many ways, fail at what they're trying to do, but the issues they introduce are very important. The final sort of big theme I think you need to focus on is racism in this time period. This is arguably the most racist time in American history. It's just appalling. Racism, white supremacy, and so forth, always native clearances, even in the Puritans and even the Quakers to a certain degree, with the Paxton Boys back in the 1760s, were doing the ethnic cleansing of natives. But there's something about the emancipation of the slaves, the rise of new immigrants, the poverty that comes with new immigration, the issue of what do you do with the freedmen, leads to this just extraordinary consolidation of a bunch of racist ideas. And in many ways, national unity after the Civil War is achieved when the North decides to abandon black civil rights. Jim Crow does not snap into place in 1870. It slowly creeps in and really reaches its apex with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Immigrants, again, seen as genetically inferior, the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans. This was very much, an argument amongst people for the white Protestant America. One of the more ironically named groups was the splinter party, the Liberal Republicans. They were liberal in the sense that they wanted small government, like classical liberalism, but they were anti-minority, anti-black, very heavily Protestant. The Gilded Age gets a bad rap for this. And rightfully so. This was a period where, the promise of the Republican Party was free soil, free labor, free men. Free soil, free from slavery. Free labor, both the slave and the working man. And this would create a free society. And I think it's pretty clear by 1898 that that's not happened. Labor is increasingly powerless, working in bad conditions. But on the whole, the country is getting wealthier. I think by 1900, it's fair to say America is, one of the 2 or 3 most powerful countries economically and so forth in the world. And so we look at America in 1860 or 1861 at Fort Sumter, and we look at it at 1898, and it's just a fantastically different country. As a result, because of these sort of continuity and change questions can be very significant on the exam. If they want to ask you a continuity and change question, it could very well be on this time period. Because it can be kind of difficult to nail it down, this is a popular time period for DBQs because you'll have the documents to help spur your memory. And there's a strong sense of, I don't like this. It's not as sort of sexy, as you will, as the Civil War, the Revolution, or, the Great Depression or post-war America. Those all have a little more sizzle. But America is really in many ways created in this time period. The America of the industrial behemoth, the America of big cities. And you can even look at guys like Booker T. Washington, W. Du Bois, and Ida B. Wells. You have the beginning of a strong push against this idea of white supremacy as well. So the Gilded Age is complicated, but again, hopefully these themes help you sort of break down the material and organize it. Hope this helps. Bye.